Please welcome our panelists, the CEO of Dangote Group, Aliko Dangote. The CEO of Biotherm Energy, Jasandra Naika. CEO of Black Rhino, Brian Herlihy. John Kumanteros, Chairman, Flour Mills of Nigeria. And please welcome our moderator from Bloomberg TV, David Weston.
Thank you very much for being here. You might have gotten the hint from that video. This is about infrastructure. If you're not interested in infrastructure, you're probably in the wrong room. So we're going to have a great, exciting discussion about infrastructure with a terrific panel here. And I want to start with you, Mr. Dangote. I mean, you are head of the largest conglomerate in West Africa, largest employer in Nigeria, and you are heavily involved in infrastructure. Tell us about the most important infrastructure project that you're involved with today.
Well, thank you very much, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Well, the major infrastructure that we're involved right now today is actually what you call is a gas pipeline, which is, we call it East-West Offshore Gas Gathering Station. You know, we've had quite a lot of problems with gas in Nigeria, and what we are trying to do now is to see how we can get the gas off the ground. We have quite a lot of gas reserves, but there's no infrastructure to evacuate the gas. So what we are doing, we are building a subsea gas pipelines, you know, two of them, which is 550 kilometers each, and each one will transport about 1.5 billion scoop of gas, which can generate about 12,000, megawatts. We have about 3 different, free-trade zone. One is, in the Delta. The other one is in Ogun State, which is Olokola. Then we have one Lekki free zone, which we are building the refinery, fertilizer, and then we have the West African gas pipeline, which has been built, but it has been empty most of the time with no gas. There's quite a lot of gas wells around, but the only thing is that nobody is actually producing the gas or the oil because there's no infrastructure. So we're building this infrastructure to be able to evacuate about 12,000, about 3 billion scoop of gas. 3 billion scoop of gas can actually generate 12,000 megawatts of power. I mean, today in Nigeria, we are not short of, power stations, but we're short of gas. We have more than we have more than 6,800 megawatts of power that's not in use because there's no gas. So what we are doing, we're actually trying to build this infrastructure, which will be ready in 2018, and this will actually resolve most of the problems of gas, or 100% of the problems of gas, right from Nigeria up to Ghana, Benin, Togo, and Ghana.
So you are building this pipeline that goes from east to west, undersea.
That's right.
To collect this gas, which is now being flared largely, right, burned off.
Yes.
How do you then distribute it to the power plants? What's the infrastructure from the point of your pipeline out to the actual power plants?
Well, you see, our own actually is to transport the gas through to its destination, and then there will be people who will have power plants, which they will use the gas. So it's like a vehicle to transport the gas. And part of it also, we have, a joint venture with Black Rhino, which is part of Blackstone, which we are also into power station. And they are also involved in this same gas infrastructure, because if you remember, the last 2 years, we announced a joint venture of about $5 billion. So this is one of the things that we are doing, together.
Which leads us to Brian Herlihy from Black Rhino, which is owned by Blackstone, in fact. And Brian has been involved for many years, 20 years in Africa, and is involved in really developing projects throughout Africa. And as you say, is a joint venture partner with you. What is your participation in this project?
Well, I think first when we looked at partnering with Dangote Industries, we really wanted to have a relationship with someone who knew Nigeria and knows Africa. I think the first amazing part of a relationship is being able to call someone. Nigeria has been a difficult place to invest in, but with great opportunity. And to be able to call someone like Aliko of his stature and ask him what he's thinking about, and is this the right time to invest, is immeasurable. As far as the participation, right now the JV is looking at 950 megawatts of projects, some in PV, some in gas-fired. But as Aliko said, we're stunted by access to gas. You know, that is the big issue right now. How do we really meet the demand in Nigeria? We need much greater access to gas. And the gas is there. That's the frustrating part. You know, we just need to bring it onshore. So we co-develop with Dangote Industries through the JV. And with the pipeline, Dangote Industries is taking the lead, and we're participating with them as an investor and a co-developer.
So Brian, why hasn't this been done before? If it's such a good idea, is it lack of capital? What's been the hurdle?
I think the supply to market of gas pricing has been skewed up until recently in Nigeria. Up in a long time, gas prices were suppressed with the idea that cheap gas would benefit Nigeria, when actually the market sufficed. You needed to have the gas price priced right so that people would want to exploit it. And Nigeria has come a long way in doing that. You know, so I think the opportunity is there. The other is vision. You know, you really have most of the gas controlled by the international oil companies, and they haven't thought domestically. You know, and when you talk about vision, you talk about Dangote Industries. That's where the vision starts. So we're part of that.
Well,
Please.
I mean, if you look at really going to build $3 billion worth of infrastructure, even the oil majors are not really going to do that at all, you know, because it's not part of their core business. So really you need somebody with boldness to be able to go there and, you know, put up this kind of investment. And that's really what we are doing, to open up the power situation in Nigeria.
So another potential beneficiary of this project is John Kumataros. He's chair of Flour Mills PLC, Nigeria. And it's the largest, and I understand it, agribusiness in Nigeria. One of your needs is fertilizer. And how does that plug into this project?
Well, I would say that what we're doing is very small compared to what Aliko is doing. But
you have 11,000 employees. Don't sell yourself short here.
Well,
you're the biggest agribusiness in Nigeria, right?
Well, and we're involved in a real paradigm shift, one that is really critical for the success of the nation and of the continent. Moral imperative, economic imperative, one that requires infrastructure, and one that will be very an important paradigm shift for investors to understand. And that paradigm shift is that with a strong Naira in the past, imports have been coming into the country, feeding the industries on the coast, and the hinterland has been a subsistence farming and subsistence consumption agriculture. Now, with lack of foreign exchange resources, there has to be integration of the hinterland to the cities and to the industries. And by doing that, we create instead of going inbound this way, we go outbound that way. It's a 180-degree shift in the supply chain. And it's a critical imperative, because that's going to create a virtuous cycle of GDP economic growth. I mean, just to do 20 million tons of grains, which is what Nigeria does, that employs close to 10 million farming families. So if we engage that, and that becomes a core part of the value chain and the supply chain, not only to feed the country, but to export, which we've begun to do with soybean meal and other things, this creates a huge dynamic, a huge GDP growth, and it requires infrastructure in order to do that, and it requires partnerships and capacity building along the value chain. So the opportunity for investors is that there's a huge need for capacity building to shift that supply chain from out to in, from in to out. And that's why the investments in fertilizer and gas and solar energy and all the other investments that are being made to help build capacity is crucial for the future of the nation. And failure is not an option, and it's an opportunity really to create value and capacity.
John, I ask you the same question I asked Brian in the natural gas sphere. What has been the hurdle? What has been the obstacle so far? Why hasn't this happened already?
Well, you know, things take time to change. You're now aggregating from 10 million farmers. That's 10 million points of light. So how do you access those farmers? I mean, the agriculture involves three things. It involves agronomy, it involves aggregation, and it involves route to market. So agronomy is, how do you cultivate the land? How do you put more land into cultivation? How do you get better yield by fertilizer, by seed, propagation, water management technique? Aggregation means, well, you produce and harvest 3 months of the year, 4 months of the year. What happens during the other 8 months? How can you extend that supply chain and store it in silos so it doesn't rot on the fields or go to waste? So aggregation is number 2 block. Number 3 block is route to market. The roads are an important element. The rail system is an important element. The silo systems that exist in the country are important elements. And what we need to do is, and the fertilizer, right now, Nigeria imports most of the fertilizer. In 2 years, it won't. What we need to do is unlock capacity that exists. And I think President Buhari mentioned that the rails will be liberalized, so now we can get the rail network working and really functioning and providing value, silos put into activation, and really engage business to, along with government, to really engage in unlocking and facilitating those things that need to be done.
We've talked about natural gas and the energy that comes from natural gas. It brings us to Jasandra Niker. She is CEO of Biotherm Energy, and they invest in renewable energy projects around Africa, Pan-Africa, really.
That's correct.
The fastest growing renewable energy company, and it's mainly solar and wind, as I understand it, Jasandra.
That's correct.
So tell us about your business, about where it is now, where it's growing to, and again, what are the hurdles?
Sure, thank you for that, and thank you, everyone. Biotherm develops, builds, and operates wind and solar projects across the African continent. We started in South Africa 5 years ago now, when we won 3 projects in the first round of the South African Renewable Energy Program. We have built those projects. They've been operational for some 3 years. They've connected to the grid. And in addition to that, we have expanded our reach. We're in Zambia. We're in Burkina Faso. We're currently negotiating a PPA and a PPP with the government of Burkina. We're just won last week in Ghana, a 20 megawatt solar PV project. And in addition to that, in South Africa, we're closing another 284 megawatts of wind and solar. We're vertically integrated as a company, and as a result of which, it allows us to really drive the ability to accelerate the development of these assets. We're very specific in terms of our approach. We really look at each project on its own. We don't have a cookie-cutter approach. And when we look at projects in any country or at any site, I think the key things that we look at is the grid. So grid infrastructure is really key for us. We don't necessarily go for the largest or most transformational project. For us, the key thing is how quickly can we put that power onto the grid and actually provide power to people. So many of our projects are much smaller, and it's aligned in terms of, do we need to increase that grid infrastructure in order to build it? Over and above that, we're funded by a US investor. Denham Capital is the investor behind Biotherm, and they've assisted in terms of us rolling out this roadmap, and quite aggressively, having grown 400 to 400 megawatts in 4 years.
So what role does the government play in these various countries, either for good or for not so good?
The government's absolutely key. They're our primary off-taker for wind and solar, for any renewable project or any power project for that matter, in most African countries. We're now seeing renewed interest from the commercial and industrial users, specifically large multinational companies who are looking to procure their own private power. But predominantly we work with governments. And the reason why it's very successful in some countries over others is the fact that there's a very transparent regulatory framework that sits in place in terms of allowing one to actually go through a process, secure a PPA, develop the project, and actually implement it. And I think that's key, the transparency, the regulatory framework that needs to be in place. And it's not always, the thing that's always advantageous to a developer. There's compromise from all parties in terms of what that PPA, power purchase agreement, actually entails. And I think because it's a standard document, it's bankable, the lenders in the market, the DFIs and commercial banks find it attractive and are willing to invest and fund these projects.
So Aliko, let me ask you a version of the same question. You're involved not just in Nigeria, you're involved through many countries throughout Africa. Where do you see governments doing really well in terms of facilitating infrastructure, and where is there room for growth?
Well, in a lot of areas, there's quite a lot of areas, for growth, like the PPP, which is public-private partnership. of which, today it might be very difficult for government to easily raise money and do projects. And some of the projects is going to cost them much more money. So it is really very good for them to partner with private sector to be able to grow the economy, to have sort of, growth. And if you look at it, today, in most of the things, I mean, you go to places like Senegal, like also Abidjan and Co, where they have toll roads, and those toll roads, they have actually opened up the economy. People are now able to move around freely in a very, very short period of time. But some of the governments they still do believe that no, government should take the front seat, which is wrong. They will be able to diversify their economy and also grow the economy much bigger if they partner with private sector. I mean, if you look at a country like Nigeria, in the last 5-7 years, the growth of the economy is actually, I mean, the GDP growth is almost 83-85% contributed by private sector. So you can't really do away with private sector.
So Brian, shifting the focus from governments to capital, private capital. I mean, Blackstone owns Black Rhino. Blackstone has stepped up and they're investing in Africa. What are the biggest impediments to capital investment? And a second question is, how much capital for these infrastructure projects is coming from within Africa and how much is coming from outside?
Sure. I think first, before you speak about capital, you have to speak about what we're doing. So as Jasandra explained, a PPA is like a long-term prenuptial, or you're getting married and thinking about everything that could go wrong and trying to put it into a contract up front. And governments sometimes dislike it. Why make it so complex? Particularly us Americans, we like to make everything really complex. I think President Obama spoke about Power Africa today. When he launched Power Africa 2 years ago at the U.S.-Africa Summit, it's been incredibly important the amount of capacity that's come in and said, what do these agreements mean? What are we trying to achieve? And it's really kick-started a lot of discussions between private capital and the governments themselves. But you have to think about what the end game is. It's not just getting power. It's actually now having a foundation of investment that's quite mature. Yeah. And that permits secondary capital to come into these countries. We spoke about in the green room the trillions of dollars that sit in the insurance markets and the pension funds and the like. They're not primary investors. The Blackstones of the world who come in and actually build something, they build something with the ability to exit it to secondary investors who want something that's already been made and is nice and neat for them. And not a lot of that exists in Africa today. There are a few companies, Dangote Industries, maybe Sanlam, a few of the banks, where these guys can come in and play. And that's what excites me about this space, is not only are you physically building something, but you're actually contributing to the maturity of these markets that will attract long-term patient capital, and ultimately enable countries to become crisis resistant. When the infrastructure is there, we talked about South Korea, we talked about Dubai. When the infrastructure is there, secondary money can come in and pick up those assets after a crisis, and that's exciting. President Maseri, the former president of Botswana, once said that developing countries is an action. After a period of time, you're either developed or you're undeveloped. And we need to be part of that, and I think infrastructure plays a big role in developing these countries to reach that secondary level of the market.
Yeah, and as you suggest, when you have insurance company money or pension plan money, that is by definition patient money, because they have it out there for 30 years or more because they have obligations out in the far distant future, which is an advantage. But Jasandra, Power Africa was just mentioned. Yes. How important has Power Africa been in your business?
Power Africa has been, I would say, pretty important to our business, and more so in the last 2 years. I have to admit, when Power Africa first launched, we didn't really know how to deal with the animal, if I could call it that. But as they refined their processes, they put people on the ground, we actually use Power Africa often as a first-stop shop for access. And a good example of that is recently we wanted to look at do a grid study very quickly in Nigeria. And I think I may have sent an email out to the Power Africa team very late that evening. By the next morning, I knew who the grid consultant was that was going to go work with me. And I can be honest with you that would never have happened if I if I didn't have that capability or service available to me, it really, reduced the timeline to send our team out to Nigeria by about 10 days because, someone was already found, was actually in Abuja, someone that could work with us immediately. And to me, that says it accelerates and catalyzes development. And for us, that's very important. And specifically as a Pan-African developer, when we go into new countries, for us to really understand the lay of the land very quickly, we reach out to Power Africa.
John, I mean, you don't have a power agriculture, at least that I'm aware of. We don't have that program yet. But as you talk about the transformation in agriculture in Nigeria, you now are on the cusp of actually exporting, as I understand it. Does that make you more vulnerable to commodities prices as a practical matter, or are you insulated from that?
Well, I think we've started to export Nigerian soybean meal made from Nigerian soybean in an extraction plant. So as long as the pricing is right internally, I think there's market, and there's many more markets to grow from that. I'm confident of getting Brian invested in agribusiness. And just on the role of government, I think on this stage we're widely supportive of the invisible hand. But I think government plays three other additional hands. I think it plays the role of the guiding hand because policy is critical to create a stable platform. It plays the role of the enabling hand in order to enable and facilitate. And sometimes it can play the role of the helping hand, for example, in giving interest rates to agriculture and so on. And I think Minister Andela is actively engaged in developing sectoral policy. ADB is working heavily on financing some infrastructure projects, and all the ministries are engaged in developing policy and in helping. Really, it's a partnership between business and government.
Aliko, this is the second of these sorts of business forums that Bloomberg Philanthropies has put on with the Department of Commerce. How much progress has been made in Africa? It's a broad question on infrastructure in the last 2 years.
Well, there's quite a lot of progress that has actually been made. This has also allowed the American companies to understand more about Africa, because majority of them, they only read from the papers and now make up their minds about investing in Africa. But that's quite a lot. If you look at it, without having the first forum, we wouldn't have actually come together with Blackstone to sign a deal of $5 billion. So that's a really, really great, achievement. And by what we are looking for, especially the relationship between the companies here, is for them to learn and understand more about, Africa. And for us also to be talking to each other. This will help in terms of making deals, for mutual beneficial relationships. U.S. is huge, is big in agriculture. In Africa, we have land. Just like what I said earlier on in one of the conferences, that Nigeria has more arable land than China. But so we really, truly need big farming companies that can come, the Cargills and co, that can come into Nigeria and invest heavily. And also trying to bring, mechanism of outgrower system so that the people within the area will also be involved, they will be empowered. And this is what, we are doing. You have asked John a question of, okay, how is he going to deal with the export? Right now, I think in a place like Nigeria, it is now for us to feed ourselves, not export. You're talking about in the next 3 years, we're going to have a population of over 200 million people. I mean, today we import 95 or 96% of the sugar we consume. So both our company and his own group were actually battling to see how we could make Nigeria self-sufficient in sugar. And that's going to take us a lot of time because Nigeria's population growth is almost 3% per annum. And that's a huge challenge.
Which creates also a huge opportunity.
A huge opportunity, yes.
Exactly.
That's right.
So Brian, actually, Aliko was just saying U.S. companies sometimes don't understand or don't know enough about Africa. What's the biggest misconception or the thing that most you would like U.S. investors, whether they're companies going in or whether they're investment companies, what would you like to correct in their minds?
Everything has to be priced, the reward and the risk, and I think Africa's reward risk is the best in the world right now to be able to achieve the type of long-term returns that you see in Africa are hard to reach elsewhere. But it's very difficult understanding from a New York perspective, what the media portrays. And the media has been incredibly sensational in some of it because it is sensationalist to report. But it's not to say it's easy either. If you can't create the partnerships and the relationships, then I don't think you're going to be successful there. And I think that's what we've valued the most, in not saying to Blackstone, here's what we think, but actually, our relationship with Dangote Industries, but also with GE, also with the different banks, also with the different players, and sitting down and saying, what do all of you think? And there are times to pause and there are times to go forward, but you don't want a pause to become a withdrawal. You want to make sure the pause is just being smart about your investment, and then at the right time, collectively moving forward again. And that's probably been the biggest challenge, is convincing the capital to be very dynamic at how they're perceiving and digesting the data to move forward.
Yeah, I love doing these panels, being in the media, because sooner or later we get to the point that it's the media's fault. It's just a question of how far on the panel you get before you get to that point, which I accept full responsibility for. We don't understand it well enough. Just Sandra, as we go around the world and look at, so I just came from China and visited some renewable energy companies there. Thus far, at least in the Western world, United States, it can't survive without significant government subsidies. We may get to that point, but it hasn't thus far. Is that true in Africa as well?
No. Renewables in South Africa and in many African countries are basically being built without subsidies. In 9 out of 10 markets that we operate in, it is an auction-based program, so it's a highly competitive bidding tender program where we all have to evaluate at what price we could actually offer a tariff to the government. And in most instances, we are highly competitive with the levelized cost of electricity in that particular country, if not cheaper. So there are no subsidies. What has happened over the last decade in the renewable energy sector is the fact that the cost of production has come down quite significantly. If we look at projects that were built in Europe or Italy in the early 2000s, they were sitting at €3 per kilowatt hour. I mean, it's unheard of, If you got that, that's truly, you're very fortunate. And I think they were overpriced because that's why many of those countries had to go into a retroactive tariff procedure. In South Africa, in the last round, we procured wind and solar at roughly 4 cents, $4 for wind. And I mean, that is highly competitive relative to levelized cost of electricity. But one thing we need to look at is you can't just assume, well, in South Africa or Zambia, we secured solar for $5 that the government of any government, say Ghana, can actually do the same. Because you have to take a variety of things into consideration. What the irradiance is, so the quality of the feedstock, be it wind or solar, the grid, the ability to connect to the grid, whether there's some indirect taxes that are associated with the project, are you giving a percentage to the local community or not? And so, you can't say, well, one price fits all. And really, you need to look at a tariff or the cost of electricity relative to that particular country, the rules of engagement, and what the outcome is. Because the last thing you also don't want to have is a very cheap or low tariff and a project never being built.
So, Alika, I want to give you last word here. I mean, we have an expression here, you have to ask for the order. So we have heads of state here, we have CEOs from the United States, CEOs from Africa. If you had to ask for one order coming out of this forum, what would it be? What do you want?
Well, what I want is more relationship between American companies and African companies, which means translates to more investment. And I think we really need to team up together. The opportunities are there, and there's nowhere you can have a better return than investing in Africa. So I look forward to that.
There we have it. Okay. Thank you very much to all our panelists. This is John Koumentaros, Jasanda Naicker, Brian Hurley, and of course, Aliko Dangote. Thanks very much. That was terrific. And thank you for your attention.